Where are you exactly? The question seems trivial. You are reading these words. You are sitting or standing somewhere specific, in a particular room, in a particular city, on a particular planet, at a particular moment. The body that contains the consciousness reading these words has a specific location, and the location can be measured, mapped, photographed from above. To ask where you are is, on the surface, the simplest of questions. The answer is wherever your body happens to be, and the body is wherever it can be pointed at, picked out, distinguished from the things around it that are not your body. This is the common sense view of where you are, and it has served well enough across the history of human practice. But when modern physics is taken seriously, when the actual structure of physical reality is examined at the levels available to 20th and 21st century investigation, the common sense view turns out to be, in profound and measurable ways, wrong. You are not in a single place in the way you have been taking yourself to be. The very concept of being in a single place, of having a definite location that can be specified independently of the rest of the universe, dissolves under sufficiently careful examination, and what emerges, when the dissolution is allowed to land, is a picture of physical reality in which the question of location is not the simple thing it appears to be in ordinary experience. The location of every particle in your body is, at the most fundamental level we can probe, indefinite. The connections between distant regions of space are, on the most rigorous experimental tests we have been able to perform, more direct than any classical picture allows. The very space that contains things turns out to be derivative of something deeper that does not have the property of containing things at definite locations. This is the situation we will be exploring in this series, and the question of what it means for a being like yourself to exist in a universe organized this way is the question this entire investigation is designed to address. The first cracks in the classical picture of definite location appeared in the early decades of the 20th century with the development of quantum mechanics. The decisive moment came in 1927, when Werner Heisenberg, then a young physicist working in Copenhagen with Niels Bohr, formulated what would come to be called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The principle states that certain pairs of physical quantities cannot simultaneously have definite values. The most famous version of the principle concerns the position and momentum of a particle. Heisenberg showed, through a careful analysis of what measurement actually involves at the quantum level, that you cannot simultaneously know both where a particle is and how it is moving. The more precisely you know the position, the less precisely you can know the momentum, and the relation between the two precisions is given by a specific mathematical formula involving Planck's constant. This is not a statement about the limitations of measurement technology. It is a statement about the structure of physical reality itself. A particle does not have a definite position and a definite momentum simultaneously, in the way classical physics had assumed. The two properties are, at the deepest level, incompatible. Specifying one to perfect precision leaves the other completely undetermined. The implications of the uncertainty principle for the question of location are profound. If a particle does not have a definite position when its momentum is well defined, then the particle is not, in any classical sense, in a particular place. It is, in the language of quantum mechanics, in a superposition of positions distributed across some region of space according to a wave function whose mathematical structure encodes all the information about where the particle might be found if measured. The wave function is not a description of where the particle actually is. The wave function is, on the standard interpretation that has dominated quantum mechanics for the better part of a century, the deepest description of the particle that physics provides. And the wave function does not specify a single location. It specifies a distribution of probabilities, a cloud of potential locations, none of which is the location until a measurement is performed. This recognition was made dramatically vivid by the famous double-slit experiment, which has been performed in increasingly precise forms across the past century, and which has come to stand as the canonical demonstration of the strange behavior of quantum objects. The basic experiment is simple. A source emits particles, electrons or photons or larger molecules, one at a time, toward a barrier with two narrow slits in it. Beyond the barrier is a screen that records where each particle arrives. If the particles behaved like classical objects, like little balls passing through one slit or the other, the pattern on the screen would be two bands, one behind each slit. But this is not what happens. The pattern on the screen is an interference pattern, with bright and dark bands, exactly the kind of pattern that would be produced if the particle had passed through both slits simultaneously, and the resulting waves had interfered with each other. The particle, in other words, did not have a definite location when it passed through the barrier. It went through both slits, in some sense that classical intuition cannot fully capture, and the interference pattern is the experimental signature of this non-classical behavior. The double-slit experiment has been performed with electrons, photons, neutrons, atoms, and even relatively large molecules. In 2019, a team led by Markus Arndt at the University of Vienna performed the experiment with molecules consisting of more than 2,000 atoms, demonstrating that the wave-like behavior characteristic of quantum mechanics persists at scales that begin to approach the boundary of what is normally considered macroscopic. The experimental results have been confirmed countless times, in countless variations, with different kinds of particles and different experimental geometries. The conclusion is unambiguous. Quantum particles, in conditions where their behavior can be carefully isolated, do not have definite locations between measurements. They exist in distributed states across the regions where their wave functions are defined, and the locations they appear to have when measurements are eventually performed are themselves the result of the measurement process rather than properties the particles had before being measured. A particularly striking version of the double-slit experiment, performed in many variations across the past decades, involves what physicists call the which path information. If a detector is placed near one of the slits, in such a way that it can determine which slit each particle goes through, the interference pattern on the screen disappears. The particles, when their path is known, behave like classical particles, and the screen shows the two-band pattern that classical intuition expects. But if the which path information is erased, even after the particle has already been recorded on the screen, the interference pattern returns. This delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, originally proposed by John Wheeler in 1978 and performed in increasingly precise forms beginning in the 1990s, demonstrates that the question of whether a particle had a definite location depends on whether the location is, in some sense, knowable. The particle does not behave as if it had a definite location until the conditions for that location to be measured are in place, and whether those conditions are in place can be determined in some experimental arrangements after the particle has already arrived at its destination. The very concept of a definite location in these experiments becomes more provisional than classical intuition allows. Where the particle was depends, in some sense, on what could be known about where it was, and that what could be known is not always determined at the time the particle is supposedly at a location. This is already a substantial departure from the classical picture of location. But the most striking results in the dissolution of locality came from a different line of investigation, beginning with a thought experiment that Einstein himself proposed in 1935 with two younger collaborators, Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen. The paper they published together, titled "Can Quantum Mechanical Description of Physical Reality Be Considered Complete?" is one of the most important and most misunderstood papers in the history of physics. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen were not arguing for the strange features of quantum mechanics. They were arguing against them. Their goal was to show that quantum mechanics, despite its impressive empirical success, must be incomplete, because it predicted features of physical reality that were, in their view, manifestly impossible. The thought experiment involves what we now call entangled particles. Imagine a process that produces two particles in correlated quantum states, sent off in opposite directions to be measured at distant locations. The quantum mechanical description of such a system says that, until the particles are measured, neither has a definite value for the relevant property. But the two particles are correlated in such a way that, when one is measured and produces a specific result, the other particle is instantaneously determined to have the corresponding correlated result. No matter how far apart the two particles have travelled, the measurement on one particle appears to instantly determine the state of the other. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen pointed out that this seemed to require a kind of action at a distance that violated the basic principles of relativity. They concluded that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that there must be some hidden variables associated with the particles that determined their measurement outcomes locally before any measurement was performed. The strangeness of quantum mechanics, in their view, was an artifact of an incomplete theory, not a feature of physical reality. The argument was rigorous, the conclusion seemed compelling, and for nearly 30 years, physics did not know how to settle the question. The status of the EPR thought experiment, as it came to be called, remained a matter of philosophical debate. Some physicists, following Einstein, believed that hidden variables would eventually be discovered and would resolve the apparent strangeness. Others, following Niels Bohr, believed that quantum mechanics was complete and that the strangeness was simply how reality was. Without an experimental test that could distinguish the two views, the debate seemed unresolvable. The decisive theoretical breakthrough came in 1964 from John Stuart Bell, an Irish physicist who had been working on related problems while employed at the European Organisation for Nuclear Research known as CERN. Bell's paper, titled On the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen Paradox, derived a mathematical inequality that any local hidden variable theory had to satisfy. The inequality, now called Bell's inequality, was a constraint on the statistical correlations that could be observed between measurements on entangled particles, on the assumption that the particles had definite local properties before being measured. Bell showed that quantum mechanics predicted violations of this inequality. The two views were therefore experimentally distinguishable. If experiments showed correlations that satisfied the inequality, local hidden variables were possible, and Einstein's intuition might be vindicated. If experiments showed correlations that violated the inequality, local hidden variables were ruled out and the strange features of quantum mechanics had to be accepted as features of physical reality. The experimental tests of Bell's inequality took nearly 2 decades to perform with sufficient precision to be conclusive. The earliest attempts, by John Clauser at the University of California, Berkeley, in the early 1970s, gave results consistent with quantum mechanics, but with experimental loopholes that could not be entirely closed. The first definitive tests came from Alain Aspect, working at the Institut d'Optique in Orsay, France, in 1981 and 1982. Aspect's experiments used pairs of photons produced by a calcium atom emission process and measured their polarization correlations at separated detectors. The setup included innovations that closed important experimental loopholes, particularly by switching the polarization measurements rapidly during the photon's flight time, so that no signal could have traveled between the detectors fast enough to influence the outcomes. The results, published across a series of papers from 1981 to 1982, decisively violated Bell's inequality and decisively confirmed quantum mechanics. Local hidden variables were ruled out. The correlations between entangled particles were stronger than any local theory could account for. The implications of these results have been the subject of intensive analysis ever since. What aspects experiments showed, beyond reasonable dispute, is that the universe does not have the property of local realism. One of the two fundamental assumptions of classical physics has to be given up. Either particles do not have definite properties before being measured, or there are influences that propagate faster than light, or some combination of these violations of classical intuition. None of the available alternatives is comfortable. All of them require giving up something that ordinary experience treats as obviously true, and the experiments have been refined and extended in the decades since Aspect's original work, with each refinement closing more experimental loopholes, and with each extension confirming the violation of local realism more decisively. Anton Zeilinger, working at the University of Vienna, has been one of the most influential experimentalists in this line of work. His group, beginning in the 1990s, performed increasingly precise tests of Bell's inequality and developed practical applications of quantum entanglement, including quantum teleportation. In 2017, Jianwei Pan and his colleagues at the University of Science and Technology of China, working with Zeilinger and others, used the Chinese satellite Micius to perform Bell tests across distances of more than 1,200 kilometers, with one detector on the satellite in orbit and the other on the ground. The results confirmed the violation of Bell's inequality at unprecedented distances. Entangled particles, separated by more than 1,000 kilometers, exhibited the same non-local correlations that Aspect had measured across a few meters. The phenomenon does not weaken with distance. It is not a feature of small scales that vanishes at larger scales. It is a feature of physical reality itself, present at every distance at which entangled particles can be maintained. A particular line of experimental work deserves emphasis because of its significance for the question of whether the experimental violations of Bell's inequality are truly conclusive. The early experiments, including those of Aspect, had what physicists call loopholes, possible ways in which classical local hidden variables might still account for the results, despite the apparent violation of Bell's inequality. The two main loopholes were the locality loophole, in which it could be argued that signals between detectors might have influenced the outcomes, and the detection loophole, in which the imperfect efficiency of detectors might have allowed selective sampling that mimicked quantum predictions. Closing both loopholes simultaneously turned out to be technically demanding and required several decades of refinement. The first experiments to close both loopholes simultaneously were performed in 2015 by 3 independent groups, led by Ronald Hansen at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, by Lyndon Schalm at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, and by Marissa Justina in Zeilinger's group in Vienna. All 3 experiments, using different physical systems and different experimental techniques, decisively confirmed the violation of Bell's inequality, with both major loopholes closed. The results were published in 2015, and they represent the most rigorous experimental confirmation that local hidden variable theories are incompatible with the observed correlations of entangled particles. The non-locality of quantum mechanics is not an artifact of experimental imperfection. It is, by every test that physics has been able to devise, a feature of physical reality. The practical implications of these results have been substantial. Quantum entanglement is the basis for quantum cryptography, in which the security of communications can be guaranteed by the fundamental physical properties of the entangled photons used to share encryption keys. Any attempt to intercept the communication necessarily disturbs the entangled state in ways that can be detected by the legitimate communicators. Quantum entanglement is also the basis for quantum teleportation, in which the quantum state of one particle can be transferred to another distant particle through the combination of entanglement and classical communication. Quantum teleportation does not transfer matter or energy faster than light, since the protocol requires classical communication that propagates at light speed. But it does demonstrate that the information characterizing a quantum state can be transferred between distant particles in a way that has no classical analog. Quantum teleportation has been demonstrated experimentally many times since the first demonstration by Zeilinger's group in 1997, and it has been performed across increasingly large distances, including the satellite-based teleportation experiments of Pan's group using Mikius. These applications are not just curiosities, they are working technologies, with quantum cryptographic systems already deployed in commercial settings and quantum networks under development that promise to exploit entanglement for entirely new modes of information processing and communication. The non-locality of quantum mechanics is not just a theoretical feature, it is an experimental and technological reality. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to John Clauser, Alan Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger for their work on quantum entanglement and the experimental violation of Bell's inequalities. The Nobel Committee's recognition reflected the fact that this body of work had moved entanglement from a theoretical curiosity into an experimentally established feature of the universe. What had once been a thought experiment, used to argue for the incompleteness of quantum mechanics, had become a measured property of physical reality, confirmed in laboratory after laboratory across decades of refinement. The world is not locally real. The connections between distant systems are stronger than any local theory can accommodate, and the implications of this for the question of location are unavoidable. What Bell's theorem and its experimental confirmations establish is that physical systems do not have definite local properties in the way classical intuition assumes. A particle does not have a definite location, a definite spin, a definite polarization until those properties are measured. And the measurement of one particle can instantaneously specify the corresponding properties of a distant entangled particle, no matter how far apart the two particles are. The instantaneous specification is not a signal in any usable sense. It cannot be used to transmit information faster than light. The relativistic constraints on signal propagation are preserved. But the correlation is real, and it cannot be explained by any theory that assumes the particles have definite local properties before measurement. The locality of properties has to be given up, and what this means, for the question of where things are, is that things do not have definite wheres in the way they appear to have. The where of any quantum object is, at the deepest level, indeterminate until measured, and connected to the wheres of distant objects in ways that no classical picture can accommodate. It is important to be precise about what these results do and do not establish. They do not establish that everything is everywhere in some loose mystical sense. They do not establish that physical objects can be pointed at and said to be in multiple places simultaneously in any straightforward way. The non-locality of quantum mechanics is a specific phenomenon with specific mathematical structure that operates in specific experimental conditions. What it does establish is that the classical picture, in which objects have definite local properties that exist independently of measurement and that can be fully accounted for by local interactions, is wrong. Some deeper picture is required, and the deeper picture, whatever it turns out to be in its full development, must accommodate features of reality that ordinary intuition treats as impossible. Several frameworks have been developed to make sense of these results. The most widely accepted is sometimes called the standard interpretation or the Copenhagen interpretation, descended from Bohr's original analyses. On this view, quantum systems do not have definite properties between measurements, and the wave function is the deepest description of the system. The act of measurement causes the wave function to collapse to one of its possible outcomes, and the apparent non-locality is a feature of how the wave function relates to physical reality across distance. A different framework, the many worlds interpretation developed by Hugh Everett at Princeton in 1957 and championed by David Deutsch at Oxford and others, holds that the wave function never collapses, that all possible outcomes of every measurement are realized in different branches of a vastly proliferating universal wave function, and that the apparent non-locality is a feature of how different branches of the universal wave function relate to each other. Yet another framework, the de Broglie-Bohm or pilot wave interpretation, developed by Louis de Broglie in the 1920s and revived and elaborated by David Bohm in the 1950s, restores definite particle locations but requires explicitly non-local guiding waves. Each of these frameworks is logically consistent. Each accommodates the experimental results. None has been shown to be uniquely correct. The interpretive question remains open. A more recent framework, sometimes called cubism or quantum Bayesianism, developed by Christopher Fuchs, Carlton Caves, and Rudiger Schack beginning in the early 2000s, takes a different approach. On this view, the wave function is not a description of physical reality, but a description of the knowledge or belief states of the observer who uses it. The strangeness of quantum mechanics, on the cubist analysis, is a strangeness about the relationship between the observer and the system being observed, not a strangeness about the system itself considered independently of any observer. The non-locality of quantum mechanics, on this framework, is not non-locality of physical reality, but non-locality of the observer's information about that reality. The framework has its proponents and its critics, and like the other interpretive options, it accommodates the experimental results without committing to any specific picture of what is happening at the deepest level of physical reality. What unites these various frameworks, despite their differences, is the recognition that the classical picture of definite local properties is no longer tenable. Whatever the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics turns out to be, it will not be a picture in which physical objects have definite locations, independent of measurement, and connected only by local interactions propagating through intervening space. Some other picture is required. And in every available picture, the simple question of where something is becomes a more complex question than ordinary intuition assumes. This already represents a substantial departure from the classical view of physical existence, but the dissolution of locality goes deeper. The recognition that quantum systems are non-local at the level of measurement correlations is only the beginning. At deeper levels of physical investigation, the very space within which things are supposed to have locations turns out to be itself derivative of something more fundamental, something that does not have the property of containing things at locations. This is the picture that has emerged from work on quantum gravity, holographic principles, and the entanglement-based frameworks that have come to dominate foundational physics in the past 2 decades. The space we ordinarily think of as the most basic feature of physical reality, the container within which things are located and across which they interact, is, on the most rigorous theoretical analyses currently available, not basic at all. It emerges from something deeper, and the deeper layer does not have a where in the way space has wheres. We will be examining this picture in detail in our next inquiry. For now, what can be said with confidence is that the where of physical existence is not the simple matter that ordinary perception treats it as being. The body that reads these words is composed of particles whose individual locations are, at the deepest level, indefinite. The atoms in the body are not at particular places in the way classical pictures assumed. They are distributed states whose locations become definite only in the act of measurement and only relative to specific contexts of measurement. The spaces between the atoms, the empty regions that classical pictures treated as containing nothing, They are full of fields and vacuum fluctuations that we considered in our earlier inquiries, and that themselves do not have classical definite locations. The body that you call yours is, at the deepest physical level, a configuration of indefinitely located patterns within a substrate that itself has no clearly defined locality. This is a strange situation, but it is the situation that physics has uncovered, and its strangeness is one of the most important features of what we have come to know about the structure of reality. Physical existence is not what classical intuition assumed. The where of things is not what classical intuition assumed. The relationships between distant systems are not what classical intuition assumed. And the question of what it means to be a being with a body in such a universe becomes, when followed seriously, a question about how the very structure of physical reality is organized at levels far below the level of ordinary perception. Long before any of this was articulated in the language of quantum mechanics or experimental tests of Bell's inequalities, contemplative traditions in widely separated cultures had arrived at insights that anticipated, in their own different vocabularies and from entirely different methods, the dissolution of classical locality. The most explicit of these was the doctrine of divine omnipresence in the Abrahamic traditions, the recognition that God is not in any single place, but in every place, that the location of divinity cannot be specified in the way the location of created things can be specified, that the relationship between the divine and the world is not the relationship of one thing in space to another. The Hebrew Bible, in the 139th Psalm, contains one of the most direct articulations of this recognition. The psalmist asks where it would be possible to flee from God's presence, and answers, in a series of comprehensive denials, that there is no place in heaven, or in the depths of the earth, or in the farthest reaches of the sea where God is not present. The psalm is not making a claim about where God happens to be located. The psalm is making a claim about the structure of divine being, in which the categories of location that apply to created things do not apply in the same way. God is not in a place because God is the kind of being whose existence is not localized in the way that created things are localized. The same intuition appears in the Quranic tradition, in a verse from chapter 2 that has been the basis for centuries of Islamic theological reflection. The verse states that wherever you turn, there is the face of God. The Arabic phrase فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ has been read in many ways across the long history of Islamic exegesis, but its core meaning is unambiguous. There is no direction in which God is not present. There is no orientation of attention that fails to encounter the divine reality. The face of God, in this Quranic articulation, is everywhere, because God's relationship to space is not the relationship of one thing being in a particular place. God is present in every place, precisely because God is not located in any place. The non-locality of the divine, in this theological framework, is not a deficiency in God's location. It is a feature of the kind of reality God is. These traditions, which we will examine in detail in our third inquiry, did not arrive at their insights through measurement of entanglement correlations or through analyses of Bell's inequalities. They arrived through sustained contemplative attention to the structure of being itself. What they found, in their own different vocabularies, was that the deepest reality is not located in any single place. The deepest reality is, in some sense, each tradition articulated differently, present everywhere precisely because it is not located anywhere. The structural parallel to the modern physical picture, in which physical reality at the deepest level does not have the property of definite locality, is striking. The vocabularies differ, the metaphysical frameworks differ, but what is being articulated, in both cases, is a recognition that the categories of location that apply to ordinary objects in ordinary experience do not apply, in the same way, to the deepest layer of what is real. We will be working out the implications of this convergence across the inquiries to come. The physics is now in place. The classical picture of definite locality has been shown, by experiments of unprecedented precision, to be a feature of ordinary perception rather than a feature of reality at the deepest level. What this means for the question of where you are, what it means for the question of how you are connected to other things, what it means for the question of what kind of being you are at all, are the questions the rest of this investigation will pursue. The body that reads these words is somewhere, in the ordinary sense in which we use that word. But what it means for a body to be somewhere, when the deepest physics no longer supports the classical picture of being somewhere, is a question that ordinary common sense is not equipped to answer. The answer requires going deeper into the physics, into the geometry of how space itself emerges from something more fundamental, and then into the contemplative traditions that pointed at these recognitions long before any laboratory could measure them. And at the end of the inquiry, the question will return to you, the particular configuration of reality that is reading these words, with whatever residue of classical intuition has survived the dissolution that the physics now requires us to acknowledge. Space is not what it seems, the container that ordinary perception takes for granted, the empty stage on which physical objects move and interact, the basic geometric framework within which everything has a location, turns out, on the deepest analyses currently available in foundational physics, to be itself a derivative phenomenon. Space is not the foundation. Space is what emerges, at large enough scales, from something more fundamental that does not have the property of being a container of locations. The geometry of space, the very fact that any region of space has the size and shape and curvature it has, is the macroscopic appearance of an underlying structure whose nature is informational and non-local at its core. This is the picture that has come out of work on quantum gravity, holographic principles, and entanglement-based pictures of emergent spacetime over the past several decades. And what it implies for the question of where things are is that the very wheres themselves, the locations within which we ordinarily think of things as being situated, are not basic features of reality. They are appearances generated by something deeper, and the something deeper is, in a precise sense, the picture is still working to articulate, not somewhere. The first step toward this radical reconception came from quantum field theory, the framework that has dominated fundamental physics since the middle of the 20th century. We considered the basic structure of quantum field theory in our earlier inquiries, but the implications for the question of location deserve attention here. In quantum field theory, the fundamental entities are not particles. The fundamental entities are fields, and the fields are not located in particular places. They permeate all of space. The electromagnetic field is everywhere. The electron field is everywhere. The various fields associated with the strong and weak nuclear forces are everywhere. What we observe as particles are localized excitations of these underlying fields. An electron is not a small thing in a particular place. An electron is a particular configuration of the electron field, more concentrated in some regions than in others, with the apparent localization being a feature of how the field is configured, rather than a feature of where some independent thing happens to be sitting. This is already a significant departure from the classical picture. The localization of a particle, on the field theoretic view, is not the location of an independent thing. It is the localized intensity of an underlying distributed structure. The particle is, in some sense, the field expressing itself in a particular pattern, and the field itself is not located. The field is everywhere where the relevant physical conditions allow it to be defined, which means, in practice, everywhere in the universe where the standard model applies. The particle that we say is here is, more accurately, the field being especially concentrated here, while the same field continues to extend throughout the rest of space. There is no boundary at which the particle ends and the not particle begins. There is only a continuous distribution of field intensity, peaking where the particle appears to be and falling off elsewhere but never falling to zero. The particle and the field are aspects of the same underlying reality, and the underlying reality does not have the property of being in any single place. The implications of this for the question of where you are direct. The atoms in your body are localized excitations of various quantum fields. The fields themselves extend throughout all of space. The atoms are particular concentrations of field intensity within larger field distributions that have no specific location at all. The body that you call yours is, on this analysis, a region of especially concentrated field activity within a much larger pattern of field activity that includes the room around you, the building around the room, the planet, the solar system, the galaxy, and the entire observable universe. The boundary between you and what is not you, at the deepest physical level, is not a boundary between things. It is a gradient in the intensity of underlying fields that themselves have no boundary at all. This picture, however striking, is only the beginning of what foundational physics has come to recognize about the non-local nature of physical reality. The deeper development came from work on quantum gravity and the holographic principle, which we considered in our earlier inquiry into the structure of the void. The holographic principle, articulated in its modern form by Gerard Hooft at Utrecht University in 1993 and Leonard Susskind at Stanford University in 1995, holds that the information content of any region of space is fully captured by a description living on the boundary of that region, rather than by any description living in the bulk of the region itself. The bulk geometry, the volume that contains things, is on this view a holographic projection from boundary information. The space inside, the regions where things are located, are derivative of information that lives, in a precise sense, somewhere else, on the boundary surface that surrounds the region. What the holographic principle implies for the question of location is striking. If the bulk geometry is derivative of boundary information, then the question of where something is, in the bulk, is a question about how the boundary information has been organized to produce the appearance of a thing in that bulk location. The thing is not really in the location in the way ordinary intuition assumes. The thing is the bulk manifestation of boundary information that itself does not have a location in the bulk at all. The location is a kind of optical illusion generated by the projection process that produces the bulk from the boundary, and the underlying reality, the boundary information, exists in a different mode that does not include the property of being at any particular bulk location. The most rigorous theoretical confirmation of the holographic principle came from Juan Maldacina's 1997 work on the ADS CFT correspondence, which established that a particular theory of gravity in a five-dimensional anti-de Sitter spacetime is mathematically equivalent to a particular four-dimensional quantum field theory, living on the boundary of that space. The two descriptions are completely equivalent, but they have radically different geometric structures. In one description, there is a five-dimensional bulk with gravity and matter located at various positions. In the other description, there is a four-dimensional boundary with quantum fields and no gravity at all. Both descriptions are correct. Both describe the same physics. But they assign locations to things in completely different ways because they have different numbers of dimensions and different geometric structures. The conclusion is that locations in either description are not absolute features of reality. They are features of the particular description being used, and the underlying physics, the substance of what is going on, transcends both descriptions and includes both as different aspects of a single deeper reality. This recognition has been deepened by the work on the relationship between entanglement and spacetime that has emerged in the past 15 years. The key result, which we considered in our earlier inquiry, came from Mark van Ramsdonk at the University of British Columbia in his 2010 paper, Building Up Spacetime with Quantum Entanglement. Van Ramsdonk asked, within the ADS CFT framework, what determined whether two regions of the bulk spacetime were connected, in the sense of being part of the same continuous geometry? His answer was that the connection between two regions of the bulk is determined by the entanglement between the corresponding regions on the boundary. If the boundary regions are highly entangled, the bulk regions are connected by smooth spacetime. If the boundary regions are not entangled, the bulk regions are not part of the same continuous geometry. As you continuously decrease the entanglement between two boundary regions, the corresponding bulk regions are pulled apart, the geometry between them stretches and thins, and at zero entanglement, they have separated entirely. The implications of this result for the question of location are difficult to overstate. Space-time, on this analysis, is not a container that exists independently and then gets filled with things. Space-time is held together by entanglement. Without entanglement, there is no continuous geometry, no spatial connection, no within which things can be at locations. The very property of being spatially related, of having a definite location relative to other things in a connected geometry, depends on the entanglement structure of the underlying degrees of freedom. The wares of physical reality are derivative of the entanglements, and the entanglements themselves, as we saw in the previous inquiry, are not local. The entanglement between two systems does not propagate through space at any speed. It is a feature of the joint state of the two systems, irreducible to local properties of each. The non-local entanglement is what produces the local geometry. Locality emerges from non-locality, where comes from no, where. The conjecture by Juan Maldacena and Leonard Susskind in 2013, which we examined in the earlier inquiry, takes this picture even further. The conjecture, sometimes called ER equals EPR, identifies the wormholes of general relativity, the Einstein-Rosen bridges that Einstein and Nathan Rosen described in 1935, with the entanglement of quantum mechanics, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen correlations from the same year. On the Maldacena-Susskind picture, every entangled pair of particles is connected by a microscopic wormhole, and the macroscopic geometry of spacetime is the cumulative effect of the vast network of microscopic entanglement wormholes that constitute the deeper structure of reality. The geometric connection of distant regions is the macroscopic appearance of microscopic quantum entanglement. The space that contains things is woven from the entanglement of the things it contains, and the things themselves, as we have already seen, are localized excitations of fields that themselves extend throughout the entanglement-woven geometry. This picture has been developed in considerable mathematical detail across the past decade. Brian Swingle at the University of Maryland, in 2009, and subsequent work, showed how holographic geometries can be built up from quantum tensor networks, structures that explicitly encode entanglement patterns. The relationship between specific entanglement structures and specific bulk geometries has been worked out in many specific theoretical contexts. Benny Yoshida, Daniel Harlow, John Preskill, and Fernando Postowski, in their 2015 paper, showed that holographic encoding can be understood as a quantum error-correcting code, with the bulk geometry serving as a redundant encoding of boundary information. The framework is sufficiently developed that physicists routinely speak of space-time as emergent from entanglement, and many theoretical investigations of the foundations of quantum gravity proceed on the assumption that this is the correct way to think about the underlying structure. What all of this implies, for the question of where things are, is that locations are not basic features of reality. They are derivative features, emerging from a deeper layer that does not have the property of being at locations at all. The deeper layer is informational. The information is structured in patterns of entanglement. The entanglement is not local in the sense that ordinary intuition assumes. And the apparent locality of the macroscopic world, the fact that things appear to be at specific places connected by specific geometric relationships, is the appearance generated by the underlying non-local entanglement structure. The wheres are real, in the sense that they capture genuine features of how things appear at large scales, but the wheres are not fundamental. The fundamental layer does not have wheres at all. This is a strange situation, but it is the picture that current foundational physics has been developing with increasing confidence. The picture has its critics. The full mathematical framework is not yet complete. Many specific questions about how the emergence of spacetime from entanglement actually works in the most general settings remain open, but the broad direction is well established. Locality is not fundamental. Space is not a container that exists independently of what is in it. The geometry of physical reality is woven from the underlying non-local connections that ordinary intuition does not register and that classical physics did not allow. A different but related line of investigation, less directly connected to quantum mechanics but pointing in the same direction, comes from a much older insight that has been part of physics since the late 19th century. The insight is sometimes called Mach's principle, after the Austrian physicist Ernst Mach, who articulated it in his 1893 book The Science of Mechanics. Mach's principle, in its various formulations, holds that the local properties of physical systems are determined, in some deep way, by the distribution of all matter in the universe. The inertial properties of a body, for example, are not features the body has in isolation. They are features that emerge from the body's relationship to all the other matter in the cosmos, particularly the most distant masses that constitute the bulk of the universe's gravitational influence. A body would not have inertia if the rest of the universe were not there. The local feature of having inertia is, on Mach's analysis, a global feature depending on the totality of what exists. Mach's principle was a major influence on Einstein's development of general relativity, although Einstein himself ended up with a theory that did not fully implement the principle in the strong form Mach had proposed. The relationship between Mach's principle and modern relativity has been debated throughout the 20th century, with various physicists arguing for different formulations and different degrees of compatibility. What survives, however, is the insight that local properties are not fully local. They depend, in deep ways, on the global structure of the universe. The space that contains a particular body, the geometry that gives that body its specific local context, is shaped by the matter and energy distribution of the entire cosmos. The here of any here is, in some sense, Mach was reaching for, also a there of every there. The physicist Dennis Sciama at Cambridge University, in a 1953 paper, attempted a more rigorous formulation of Mach's principle within the framework of general relativity. Sciama showed how the inertial properties of a body could be calculated, in principle, as a sum over the contributions of all the matter in the universe, with the most distant masses contributing the largest share, because they constitute the bulk of the cosmic mass distribution. The local property of inertia, on Sciama's calculation, is determined by the global distribution. The local feature is, in a precise sense, an integral over the cosmos. Subsequent work by other physicists, including Hermann Bondi and Thomas Gold, refined and extended Sciama's analysis. The principle has not been universally accepted in the strong form Mach proposed, and the question of whether general relativity fully implements Mach's intuition remains contested. But the broader picture, that local features depend on global structure, has become increasingly central to how foundational physics thinks about the relationship between parts and wholes in the cosmos. The picture that emerges when these various lines of investigation are taken together is one in which the simple intuition of definite local existence has to be replaced by a more complex picture in which the very property of being at a location is derivative of non-local structure. The fields extend throughout all of space. The geometry of space is held together by entanglement that is itself non-local. The local properties of bodies depend on the global structure of the universe. The classical container of definite locations dissolves at every level of analysis, replaced by something more interconnected, more distributed, more genuinely non-local than ordinary perception is equipped to recognize. A particularly striking development of these ideas, drawing them in the direction of consciousness, came from Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, in his short book What is Life, published in 1944. Schrödinger, working at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies during the Second World War, gave a series of lectures that attempted to bring the perspectives of quantum physics to bear on questions of biology and the nature of life. The lectures, when published, became one of the most influential scientific texts of the 20th century, anticipating in remarkable ways the discovery of the structure of DNA that would come a decade later. But the appendix to the book, in which Schrödinger turned to questions of consciousness and personal identity, has received far less attention than the main text deserved, and it is the appendix that bears most directly on our inquiry. In the appendix, Schrödinger considers the question of whether there is a multiplicity of conscious minds in the universe, or only a single mind that appears to be many through the multiplicity of bodies that instantiate it. Drawing explicitly on the Vedantic tradition of Hinduism, which Schrödinger had studied seriously throughout his life, he argues that the multiplicity is appearance and the unity is reality. There is, on his analysis, only one consciousness, and the appearance of many separate conscious beings is a feature of how the one consciousness manifests through the many bodies that exist in the world. The argument Schrödinger gives is rooted partly in his interpretation of quantum mechanics, and partly in the philosophical tradition he had been engaging with throughout his life. But the broader point, that consciousness might not be fundamentally local in the way ordinary intuition assumes, fits naturally into the picture that the foundational physics of his time was beginning to articulate, and that the foundational physics of the present is articulating with even greater rigor. The specific argument Schrödinger develops deserves attention because it bears directly on the question of where you are. He notes that if every conscious being has its own separate consciousness, completely walled off from every other consciousness, then the world as you experience it must include a vast multitude of conscious experiences that are all happening simultaneously, with each consciousness inhabiting its own private inner world. But this picture, he argues, becomes incoherent when examined carefully. The consciousness that experiences anything cannot be located in the brain in the way classical physics located objects in space. The brain is, by every measurement we can perform, a configuration of physical structures that, however complex, does not contain consciousness in any straightforwardly spatial sense. To find consciousness in the brain is, on Schrödinger's analysis, to commit a category mistake, looking for a non-spatial phenomenon among spatial structures and being puzzled when it fails to appear. The proper recognition, in Schrödinger's view, is that consciousness is not in the brain in the way objects are in places. Consciousness is, in some sense, Schrödinger reaches for through his Vedantic resources, the deeper reality that the brain expresses in its particular localized way. This argument, controversial as it was when Schrödinger made it, and as it remains today, is structurally consistent with the picture that has emerged from later developments in foundational physics. If consciousness is not local in the classical sense, then the apparent multiplicity of separate conscious beings might be, like the apparent multiplicity of separate physical objects, a feature of how a deeper non-local reality manifests at the level of ordinary perception. The same reality expresses itself through many bodies, producing the appearance of many separate consciousnesses, just as the same fields express themselves through many localized excitations, producing the appearance of many separate particles. The unity is at the level of the substrate. The multiplicity is at the level of the manifestations. And what you are, at the deepest level any inquiry has been able to reach, may not be the localized manifestation, but the non-local substrate that produces the manifestation. Schrödinger himself acknowledged that this kind of speculation goes beyond what physics can establish on its own resources, and that his conclusions drew heavily on the Vedantic philosophical framework he was bringing to bear. But the structural picture, in which consciousness is to bodies as fields are to particles, is a picture that the developments of the subsequent 80 years have not refuted, and that remains, as a serious possibility, on the table for any complete theory of how consciousness fits into the physical structure of reality. What Schrödinger was suggesting, in his cautious way, was that the apparent localization of consciousness in particular bodies is, like the apparent localization of physical phenomena in particular places, a feature of how a deeper non-local reality manifests at the level of ordinary perception. Just as the fields are not really located but appear to be in their localized excitations, consciousness might not really be located but might appear to be in its localized expressions through bodies and brains. The picture is speculative. Schrödinger himself presented it as a possibility worth taking seriously rather than as an established conclusion. But the structural parallel to the picture that has emerged from later developments in quantum gravity and holographic physics is striking. The non-local substrate gives rise to the apparently local phenomena. The apparent locality is real at its level. The non-local substrate is more fundamental. And what we are, when we ask the question deeply, may not be the locally manifested expressions but the non-local substrate that expresses itself through us. The implications of all of this for the question of where you are have been accumulating across the inquiries of this part. The atoms in your body are localized excitations of fields that extend throughout all of space. The geometry of space that contains your body is woven from non-local entanglement. The local properties of your body depend on the global structure of the universe. And the consciousness that experiences your body as your body may itself be, on the analysis Schrödinger sketched and the contemplative traditions had developed for thousands of years before him, a localized manifestation of something that is not fundamentally local at all. At every level of analysis, the simple intuition of definite local existence dissolves into a more complex picture in which locality is real at its level, but is not the deepest level, and the deeper levels, the levels that would actually answer the question of what you are at the most fundamental level, do not have the property of being at any particular place. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not the denial of ordinary location in the sense in which we use that concept in everyday life. Of course, you are sitting somewhere, reading these words at a particular spot in a particular room. The ordinary use of location remains valid at the level at which it operates. What is being denied is that this ordinary location is the deepest fact about where you are. At deeper levels, the levels at which physics has been able to probe in the past century, the where of your existence becomes more complex, more distributed, more genuinely entangled with the rest of the universe than ordinary intuition allows. You are not, at the deepest level, simply located somewhere. You are a particular configuration of patterns within a substrate whose connections to the rest of the universe are richer and stranger than any classical picture can accommodate. The somewhere you appear to be is real at its level. The somewhere is not the whole story. This recognition, when it is allowed to settle, has implications for how we think about the most basic features of existence. The boundary between you and what is not you, which ordinary perception treats as sharp and definite, is, at the deepest physical level, gradual and continuous. The the space between you and other things, which ordinary perception treats as empty distance to be crossed, is, at the deepest physical level, an entanglement-woven medium that connects you to those other things in ways that no signal-based picture can capture. The location of your body, which ordinary perception treats as a definite point or region in space, is, at the deepest physical level, a localized intensity of fields that themselves have no location at all. The very property of being somewhere, which ordinary perception treats as the most basic feature of physical existence, turns out to be derivative of features that are not somewhere in the same sense. This kind of language, of an underlying non-local substrate from which apparent locations emerge, would have sounded familiar to certain ancient contemplative traditions, who, by entirely different methods and from entirely different starting points, arrived at structurally similar pictures of how reality is constituted at its deepest level. Several of these traditions, in different cultural and theological contexts, articulated visions in which the deepest layer of reality is not located in any particular place, because it is the source from which the very property of having a place emerges. The deepest reality is, in these traditions' various vocabularies, everywhere precisely because it is not anywhere in the way that things in space are at particular places. The claim is not that the deepest reality is diffusely spread out across all of space. The claim is that the deepest reality is the source of space itself, prior to the distinction between here and there that requires a containing space within which the distinction makes sense. Pseudo-Dionysius, the anonymous 5th or 6th century author, whose mystical theology we considered in our earlier inquiry into the void, articulated this insight with characteristic philosophical precision. The deepest reality, he wrote, is not in any particular place because the categories of place do not apply to it. To say that God is here would be to put God among the things that have heres, which would falsify the kind of reality that God is. To say that God is not here, that God is somewhere else, would be equally to put God in the framework of locations, which is again a category mistake. The proper way to talk about the divine reality, on Pseudo-Dionysius's analysis, is to negate the categories of location systematically, recognizing that the divine is the source from which the very property of being at a location emerges. The divine is everywhere in the sense that nothing is outside the divine source. The divine is nowhere in the sense that the divine is not at any particular place among other places. The two negations together capture, in apophatic theological language, what modern physics is now articulating in the language of fields, entanglements, and emergent geometries. The deepest layer of reality is not in places. The deepest layer is what makes places possible. And the relationship between the deepest layer and the manifested locations is not the relationship between two things, one of which is in the other, but the relationship between a source and what derives from the source. Meister Eckhart, the medieval German Dominican, whose distinction between Gott and Gottheit we also considered in the earlier inquiry, took this analysis further by applying it to the soul. The deepest part of the soul, Eckhart argued in his sermons, is not in any particular place because it is in direct contact with the same divine ground that has no particular place. The soul has, in its surface aspects, a localization that corresponds to the body the soul animates. But in its deepest aspect, what Eckhart called the spark or the ember of the soul, the Vunkelin, the soul touches the divine ground directly, and the divine ground is not located. The deepest part of you, on Eckhart's preaching, is therefore not located either. It participates in the same non-locality that characterizes the divine source from which it derives. To recognize this, to attend to the deepest part of the soul rather than to the surface aspects that are tied to the body's location, is to enter into a different kind of self-understanding in which the question of where you are takes on different meaning than it has in ordinary self-perception. These traditions, which we will examine in detail in our third inquiry, did not arrive at their insights through the development of quantum field theory or through the experimental tests of Bell's inequalities. They arrived through sustained contemplative attention to the structure of being, often through generations of disciplined practice that took centuries to refine. What they found, in their own different vocabularies, was that the deepest layer of reality is not in any particular place, that the categories of location do not apply to it in the way they apply to ordinary objects, and that the relationship between the manifested world of locations and the underlying non-local source is the relationship between a derivative appearance and the deeper substrate from which the appearance emerges. The structural parallel to the modern physical picture, in which locality emerges from non-locality and space is woven from entanglement, is striking. The vocabularies differ, the metaphysical frameworks differ, but the recognition that the deepest reality is not localized, and that this non-localization is the source of the apparent locations of the manifest world, is convergent across multiple lines of inquiry that had no contact with each other. We will now turn to the contemplative traditions and examine in detail what they actually said, how they said it, and what their saying means in the light of the picture that modern physics has now arrived at through its own different routes. The traditions and the physics are, in a precise structural sense, pointing toward the same territory. The territory is the territory of a deepest reality that has the property of being everywhere precisely because it is not anywhere in the way that ordinary things are at ordinary places. And the question of what it means to inhabit such a reality, what it means to be a body and a self in a universe whose deepest layer is not located, is the question that the contemplative analyses will help us bring into focus in the inquiry to come. Long before any laboratory could test Bell's inequality, before there was any mathematical framework for thinking about how space-time might emerge from non-local entanglement, before quantum field theory had articulated the picture of fields as the fundamental layer beneath particles, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally similar pictures of how the deepest layer of reality is constituted with respect to location. The methods used were not measurement and theory. The methods used were sustained attention to the structure of being, often through generations of disciplined practice that took centuries to refine. What these thinkers found, when they pushed their inquiry to its deepest point, was that the deepest layer of reality is not located in any particular place. The deepest layer is, in the various contemplative vocabularies, present everywhere, precisely because it is not anywhere in the way that ordinary objects are at ordinary places. The categories of location, the heres and theirs that structure our experience of the manifest world, do not apply to what is most fundamentally real. And the relationship between the manifest world of locations and the deeper non-local source from which the locations emerge is one of the central recognitions that the contemplative traditions have organized themselves to investigate. The most explicit and theologically developed articulation of this insight in the Western religious traditions appears in the doctrine of divine omnipresence, the recognition that God is not in any single place, but is present everywhere, while at the same time not being a thing that takes up space in the way ordinary things do. The doctrine has its earliest roots in the Hebrew Bible, in passages that describe the divine relationship to space in terms that resist any straightforwardly spatial interpretation. The most famous of these passages is the 139th Psalm, which contains one of the most direct articulations of the recognition that the divine cannot be escaped by any change of location. The psalmist asks where it would be possible to flee from the divine presence, and answers, in a series of comprehensive denials, that there is no place in heaven, no place in the depths of the earth, no place in the farthest reaches of the sea where God is not present. The psalm is not making a claim about where God happens to be located. The psalm is making a claim about the structure of divine being. God is not somewhere among the things that are somewhere. God is present in every place, precisely because the kind of reality God is does not include the property of being limited to a particular location. The implications of this recognition were drawn out across centuries of subsequent theological reflection. Augustine of Hippo, writing his Confessions at the end of the 4th century, returned again and again to the question of how the divine relates to space and location. In one of the most striking passages of the work, Augustine declares that God was, in his Latin phrasing, interior intimo meo, et superior sumo meo. The phrase resists clean translation, but its meaning is unmistakable. God was more interior to Augustine than Augustine's most interior part, and higher than Augustine's highest part. The divine is not located somewhere outside, requiring the soul to travel to reach it. The divine is not located somewhere inside, occupying a particular interior space. The divine is, in Augustine's analysis, more interior than any interior, exceeding even the deepest places that the soul might reach by its own movement. The categories of inside and outside, of higher and lower, of here and there, do not apply to the divine reality in the same way they apply to created things. The divine is everywhere because the divine is not somewhere among the somewheres of the manifest world. The medieval scholastic tradition developed these insights with great philosophical precision. Thomas Aquinas, writing his Summa Theologiae in the 13th century, devoted careful analysis to the question of how God can be said to be present in all things while not being a body that takes up space. In question 8 of the first part of the Summa, Aquinas distinguishes 3 modes in which God is present in all things. There is presence by power, in which God is present to everything as the cause that sustains its existence. There is presence by knowledge, in which God knows everything that exists with the immediacy that God has to God's own ideas. And there is presence by essence, in which God's own being is the ground from which the being of every existing thing derives. None of these modes of presence, Aquinas insists, involves God being located in a place in the way that bodies are located in places. God is present in everything without occupying any place. The presence is real, but the presence is not spatial in the way that ordinary presence is spatial. The relationship between God and the world is not the relationship of one body in space to another body in space. It is the relationship of an underlying source to the manifested existence of everything that derives from the source. The apophatic tradition we considered in our earlier inquiries took these insights to their philosophical limit. Pseudo-Dionysius, in the late 5th or early 6th century, developed in his mystical theology a sustained method for approaching the divine reality through systematic negation. The deepest reality, Pseudo-Dionysius wrote, is not body, is not soul, is not intellect, is not being, is not in any particular place, is not at any particular time, is not anywhere or any when in the way that created things have heres and whens. The negations are not denials of the divine reality. They are recognitions that the categories applicable to created things do not apply to the divine source. To say that God is here is to put God among the things that have heres, which is a category mistake. To say that God is somewhere else, that God is over there rather than over here, is an equivalent category mistake in the opposite direction. The divine reality, on the apophatic analysis, is everywhere by being nowhere in the way that ordinary things are somewhere. And the somewhere of ordinary things is, in turn, the gift of the deeper source that makes the property of being somewhere possible at all. Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican, whose distinction between Gott and Gottheit we considered earlier, took the apophatic insight in a particularly striking direction. The deepest part of the soul, what Eckhart called the spark or ember of the soul, the Funkeln, is not in any particular place because it is in direct contact with the divine ground that is itself not in any place. Eckhart preached that the soul, in its deepest aspect, transcends the location-bound character of the body that the soul animates. The body is somewhere. The soul, in its surface aspects that are tied to the body, is in some sense also somewhere, sharing the body's location for the duration of their connection. But the deepest part of the soul is in contact with what is not located, and to that extent the deepest part of the soul is not located either. To recognize this, Eckhart taught, is to enter into a different kind of self-understanding, one in which the question of where you are receives a different answer than the surface ego is prepared to give. A particularly evocative articulation of these insights appears in a phrase that has been attributed to various medieval thinkers and that became famous in the 17th century through the work of Blaise Pascal. The phrase, in the form Pascal records in his Pensées, describes the divine reality as an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. The image is striking and worth pausing over. An ordinary sphere has a center at one place and a circumference at another, with the circumference enclosing the center at a definite distance. An infinite sphere whose center is everywhere reverses this geometry. There is no privileged place that counts as the center, because every place is equally the center. There is no boundary that counts as the circumference, because the sphere extends without limit. The image captures, in a single arresting metaphor, the structural recognition that the apophatic tradition had been articulating in more abstract theological vocabulary. The deepest reality is everywhere, because no place is its specific location. The deepest reality has no boundary, because no place is outside it. And the relationship between this everywhere and nowhere reality and the things that exist within it is not the relationship of one located thing to another, but the relationship of a non-located source to the located manifestations that derive from it. The phrase has a long history before Pascal recorded it. It appears in a 12th century pseudo-hermetic text known as the Book of the 24 Philosophers, which preserved a tradition of philosophical, theological aphorisms that may have older roots. The phrase appears, in slightly varied forms, in the writings of Alan of Lille in the late 12th century, in Bonaventure's 13th century theological work, in Nicholas of Cusa's 15th century philosophical treatises, and elsewhere in the long tradition of medieval Christian philosophical theology. Each thinker who used the phrase did so within the broader apophatic framework, drawing on the structural recognition that the deepest reality cannot be captured in ordinary spatial categories, and that the geometry of an infinite sphere with center everywhere is, despite its mathematical strangeness, an apt image for the structural relationship between the divine and the world. The image is not arbitrary. It captures the precise feature of non-locality that the contemplative tradition was pointing at. Every point is the center, because no point is privileged over any other in its relationship to the divine source. The boundary is nowhere, because there is no edge of the divine reality at which the divine ends and something else begins. The structural parallel to modern recognitions of how locality emerges from a non-local substrate is, again, striking. The Islamic tradition develops structurally parallel insights with particular intensity, and several of the most direct articulations of the recognition that the divine reality is everywhere and nowhere in the relevant sense come from the Quranic and Sufi sources. The Quran itself, in the second chapter, contains one of the most direct verses on this theme. The verse, in chapter 2 and verse 115, states that wherever you turn, there is the face of God. The Arabic phrase, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ, has been the basis for centuries of Islamic theological and contemplative reflection. The verse does not say that God happens to be in the direction you turn. The verse says that the face of God is there. The face of God is the divine self-revelation, the manifested aspect of the divine reality through which God becomes accessible to the created world. And this face is found in every direction. There is no orientation of attention, no direction of looking, no place toward which one can turn that fails to encounter the divine reality. The non-location of God, in this Quranic articulation, is not a limitation on God's accessibility. It is the structural feature that makes God universally accessible. Because God is not in any particular place, God is in every place. Because God's reality does not require location, the categories of direction and orientation do not constrain God's presence. A second Quranic passage, in chapter 50 and verse 16, articulates a complementary insight about the divine relationship to the human person. The verse states that God is closer to a human being than the human's own jugular vein. The image is striking and physically immediate. The jugular vein is, anatomically, one of the most intimate parts of the body, carrying blood from the brain back to the heart, essential to life and pulsing constantly with the rhythm of existence. To say that God is closer to a person than this vein is to say that the divine presence is more interior to a person than the person's own most interior physical structures. The divine is not far away. The divine is not even at the surface of the person. The divine is more inside the person than the person's own anatomy. The structural parallel to Augustine's interior intimo meo is striking, and the insight is the same. The divine reality is not located somewhere outside the person, requiring contact across distance. The divine reality is the deeper layer that the person's own existence derives from, present in every aspect of the person's being more directly than any of the person's localized features. The Sufi tradition, the contemplative wing of Islam that flourished from the early Islamic centuries onward, developed these insights into sustained practical and metaphysical frameworks. The most influential philosophical articulation came from Ibn Arabi, the Andalusian Sufi master who lived from 1165 to 1240, and whose enormous output we considered in our earlier inquiry. Ibn Arabi's central doctrine, sometimes called Wahdat al-Wujud or the unity of being, holds that there is, at the deepest level, only one reality, and that reality is the divine. All of finite existence, all the multiplicity of created things, all the apparent separations between things, are manifestations of the single divine reality, expressing itself in different aspects and configurations. The unity is at the level of the underlying reality. The multiplicity is at the level of the manifestations. And the relationship between unity and multiplicity is not a relationship between two competing realities, but the relationship between the deeper source and the surface expressions of that source. The implications of Wahdat al-Wujud for the question of location are direct. If there is, at the deepest level, only one reality, and that reality is everywhere because it is the source from which all manifestations derive, then the apparent locations of finite things are aspects of how the unified reality manifests itself in differentiated form. You are not, on this analysis, separate from the divine reality whose manifestation includes you. You are an aspect of how the divine reality expresses itself at this particular location, in this particular configuration, in this particular moment. The divine is not somewhere else, watching you from a distance. The divine is what you most fundamentally are, expressing itself through the particular form your existence takes. The recognition of this, in the Sufi tradition, is not a casual intellectual acknowledgement. It is the fruit of sustained contemplative practice, often involving the disciplines that the tradition calls fana, the annihilation of the surface ego, and baka, the subsistence in God that follows the annihilation. A particularly striking and historically charged articulation of these insights came from the 10th century Persian Sufi mystic known as Mansur al-Halak, who lived from approximately 858 to 922 of the Common Era. Al-Halak, in a state of contemplative ecstasy, uttered the phrase Ana al-Haq, often translated as I am the truth or I am the real, where al-Haq is one of the names of God in Islamic tradition. The phrase has been the subject of fierce controversy across the centuries, both at the time of its utterance and ever since. Al-Halak was eventually executed in Baghdad for what was perceived as blasphemy, the claim of personal divinity. But the more sympathetic readings, developed by later Sufi commentators, including Ibn Arabi himself and Rumi, a few centuries after, insist that Al-Halak's utterance was not a claim of personal divinity in the ordinary sense. It was, rather, a confession from a state in which the surface ego of Al-Halak had been annihilated through the discipline of fana, and what remained, what was speaking in his words, there was no longer the localized human personality, but the divine reality that had been present all along, no longer obscured by the surface ego's claim to be a separate self. The phrase was not Al-Halak claiming to be God. The phrase was the divine reality, recognized as the deepest layer of what Al-Halak was, speaking through the cleared channel that Al-Halak's annihilated ego had become. This reading, however controversial, captures something essential about the Sufi understanding of non-locality. The localization of identity in a particular ego, the conviction that what one most fundamentally is the surface personality that has a name, a body, a history, is, on the Sufi analysis, a kind of misperception. The surface ego is real at its level. It has a function. It coordinates a particular life, but it is not the deepest layer of what one is. The deeper layer is the divine reality that all surface egos derive from, and that all surface egos are, in their deeper aspect, expressions of. To recognize this, even momentarily, is to find that the question of where you are receives a different answer than the surface ego is prepared to give. You are not, at the deepest level, simply located here in this body, in this room. You are the divine reality manifesting at this location, in this body, at this moment. The you that is being referred to, when the question is pushed deep enough, is not local at all. The Hindu tradition arrived at structurally similar recognitions through its own different methods and within its own theological framework. The most direct articulation appears in a small text within the Chandogya Upanishad, one of the principal Upanishads, composed sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era. The text, in chapter 6, contains a famous teaching by the sage Uddalaka to his son Shvetaketu, in which the deepest reality, called Brahman, is described in a series of meditations that culminate in one of the most concentrated formulations in the history of religious thought. The formulation, in Sanskrit, is Tat Tvam Asi, which is usually translated as that thou art or you are that. The meaning of the formulation is that the deepest layer of the self, what the Upanishadic tradition calls Atman, is identical with the deepest layer of cosmic reality, what the same tradition calls Brahman. The two are not two, they are one. The local self that you appear to be, the self that has a name and a body and a particular location in the world, is, at its deepest layer, identical with the universal reality that is the ground of all existence. To recognize this identity is, in the Vedantic tradition, the deepest insight available to a human being, the recognition that has been called liberation, moksha, the liberation from the illusion of separate, localized existence. The implications of Tat Tvam Asi for the question of where you are profound. If you are, at the deepest level, identical with Brahman, the universal ground, then the question of where you are receives an answer that does not have the form ordinary intuition expects. You are everywhere because Brahman is everywhere. You are nowhere in particular because Brahman is not anywhere in particular. The location of your body remains a fact at its level. The body is somewhere, but the deepest level of what you are is not constrained by the body's location. The Vedantic tradition does not encourage you to reject the body's location or to ignore the conventional reality of being a particular person at a particular place. The tradition encourages you to recognize that this conventional reality is not the deepest reality, and that the deepest reality of what you are is not local at all. The Bhagavad Gita, the most widely read text within the broader Hindu tradition, contains in its 11th chapter one of the most arresting visualizations of cosmic non-locality in religious literature. In the chapter, the warrior Arjuna asks the divine teacher Krishna to reveal his cosmic form. Krishna grants the request, and Arjuna sees a vision of the divine reality that includes all of existence, all beings and worlds and times, contained within the divine form. The vision is overwhelming. Arjuna sees the entire universe within the body of Krishna, with all the gods, all the demons, all the beings of every kind, present simultaneously in the divine form. The geographical multiplicity of the cosmos, the apparent separation of places from places, is contained within a single reality that is itself everywhere and nowhere in the relevant sense. The chapter is one of the most often illustrated and meditated upon passages in Hindu literature, and the recognition it captures has structural parallels to the modern picture of how local manifestations relate to a non-local underlying reality. The cosmos is contained within the divine. The divine is not located in the cosmos. The relationship is one of derivation rather than spatial inclusion. The Vedantic tradition developed a method for approaching the deeper layer of reality that we considered briefly in our earlier inquiry into the void. The method is called neti-neti, not this, and it appears prominently in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad in the teaching of the sage Yajnavalkya. The method proceeds through systematic negation. Whatever the surface mind identifies as the self, the practitioner negates as not actually the self in the deepest sense, not the body, not the senses, not the mind, not the intellect, not anything that can be made into an object of awareness. Each negation is not a denial that the negated thing exists. The body exists, the mind exists, the intellect exists. The negation is a recognition that none of these is the deepest layer of what one is. What remains, when the systematic negation is followed to its conclusion, is the witnessing awareness that has been doing the negating, and this awareness, on the Vedantic analysis, is what one most fundamentally is. The awareness is not a thing among things. The awareness is not located in any particular place. The awareness is identical, on the Vedantic conclusion, with the universal Brahman that is the ground of all existence. And the recognition of this identity is the goal that the entire contemplative discipline is organized to achieve. The Buddhist tradition arrived at a related but distinct recognition through its own different framework. The teaching of Anatman, no self, articulated by the Buddha in his early teachings and developed across centuries of subsequent Buddhist philosophy, denies that there is any permanent unchanging self that constitutes the deepest layer of personal identity. The implications for the question of location are direct. If there is no fixed self that one fundamentally is, then the question of where one is, at the deepest level, does not have the answer that ordinary intuition expects. There is, in the Buddhist analysis, a continuous flow of arising and ceasing patterns, a stream of momentary configurations that the conventional language of selfhood imposes a fictitious unity on. The you that you take yourself to be, on the Buddhist analysis, is not really a fixed thing in a particular place. The you is a process, a flow, a continuous arising and ceasing that has no fixed center to be located. A particularly evocative articulation of this insight appears in the Huayan school of Chinese Buddhism, which flourished beginning in the 7th century and which developed one of the most sophisticated metaphysical frameworks within East Asian Buddhist thought. The Huayan tradition makes use of the metaphor of Indra's net, an image drawn from earlier Indian sources but elaborated within the Huayan framework with particular philosophical precision. The metaphor describes the cosmos as a vast net stretched across the universe, with a jewel at every node of the net. Each jewel reflects every other jewel, and the reflections themselves contain reflections of reflections in an infinite series of interpenetrating reflections that constitutes the deeper structure of reality. Every point in the net contains, through its reflections, every other point. There is no isolated location anywhere in the net. Every location is, in some sense, the metaphor reaches for, present in every other location. The cosmos, on the Huayan analysis, is structured by this kind of mutual interpenetration, with every part containing the whole, and the whole being expressed in every part. The structural parallel to the modern picture of holographic encoding, in which the information of the whole is contained in every part of the boundary, is striking. Indra's net, articulated in the 7th and 8th centuries by Huayan teachers including Fazang and others, anticipates by more than 1,000 years the holographic recognition that modern foundational physics has now confirmed in technical terms. The Jewish tradition, which we considered briefly in our earlier inquiries, contributed its own articulation of these insights through several distinct frameworks. The most direct of these is the use of the term makom, which is one of the names by which God is referred to in rabbinic tradition. The word makom, in Hebrew, simply means place. To call God by the name place is to articulate, in a single word, the entire doctrine of divine omnipresence. God is the place. God is not located in some particular place among other places. God is the place that all places are in. The relationship between the divine and any particular location is not the relationship of one located thing to another. It is the relationship of the place itself to whatever is in the place. The divine reality, on this rabbinic articulation, is what makes location possible at all. It is not somewhere among the somewheres. It is the source from which the property of being somewhere derives. A complementary articulation appears in the Lurianic Kabbalah we considered earlier, in the doctrine of Tzimtzum, the divine self-contraction. The doctrine holds that creation could not occur within the divine plenitude as it is, because the divine plenitude is everywhere and admits no place outside itself. For there to be anything that is not God, God must contract, withdraw, make a cleared region within the divine reality where finite creation can come into being. The void that results from the contraction is not absolute nothing. It is the cleared place within the divine where the multiplicity of created locations becomes possible. Without the prior Tzimtzum, there would be no places. The creation of locations, on the Lurianic analysis, requires a prior act of divine non-localization. The universal divine presence has to make room for particular created presences. And the relationship between the universal non-located divine reality and the particular located created world is one of these specific frameworks that the Kabbalistic tradition developed for thinking about the structure of being. The Taoist tradition contributes a brief but pointed articulation of these themes. The Tao Te Ching, in Chapter 4 and elsewhere, describes the Tao itself as the source from which everything flows, but as something that cannot be located or named in the ordinary sense. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, the text declares in its famous opening. The deepest reality cannot be captured in the categories of ordinary language, including the categories of location. The Tao is not in a place because the Tao is the source from which the property of being in places emerges. The structural recognition is parallel to the recognitions we have been tracing across the other traditions. The deepest layer is everywhere, because it is not anywhere in the sense that ordinary things are somewhere. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context, theological commitment, and practical orientation, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what modern physics is now articulating in its own technical vocabulary. The deepest layer of reality is not located in any particular place. The categories of location do not apply to it in the way they apply to ordinary things. The relationship between the deepest layer and the manifested locations of the ordinary world is one of derivation rather than spatial inclusion. The contemplative traditions did not arrive at these insights through measurement. They arrived through sustained attention to the structure of being itself, and what they found, in their own different vocabularies, has structural similarities to what physics is now articulating through entirely different methods. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian doctrine of divine omnipresence is not the Sufi Wahdat. Al-Wujud is not the Vedantic Tat. Tvamasi is not the Buddhist. Indra's net is not the rabbinic. Makom is not the Taoist nameless Tao. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ. The practical implications drawn from the various recognitions differ, but the structural recognition that the deepest layer of reality is not local in the classical sense, and that the apparent locations of ordinary things derive from a deeper layer that does not have the property of being at locations, is shared across all of these frameworks. And modern physics, working from entirely different premises and using entirely different methods, has arrived at a structurally similar recognition through its own roots. What this means, for the question that has been driving this entire investigation, is that the dissolution of classical locality that physics has experimentally established is not a strange new feature of reality that the contemplative traditions failed to anticipate. It is a feature of reality that the contemplative traditions had been pointing at for thousands of years in their own languages, from their own methods, with their own commitments. The traditions and the physics are pointing at the same territory, and what awaits in our final inquiry is the question of what all of this means, finally for you, the particular configuration of reality that has been reading these words, the local manifestation of what is, at the deepest level any inquiry has been able to reach, not local at all. Where are you? The question that opened this entire investigation now returns, and the answer that ordinary intuition wanted to give has been complicated, perhaps beyond repair, by everything the inquiries have uncovered. You are sitting somewhere, in the ordinary sense in which we use that word. The body is at a particular spot in a particular room. The brain is at a particular spot in the body. The eyes are focused on a particular set of marks on a particular surface. All of this is true at the level at which it operates. But beneath this level, beneath what ordinary perception recognizes, the situation is different. The atoms in your body are localized excitations of fields that extend throughout all of space. The geometry of the space that contains your body is woven from non-local entanglement that does not propagate through space at any speed. The local properties of your body depend on the global structure of the cosmos in ways that no theory of purely local interactions can fully account for. And the deepest layer of physical reality, the layer beneath the layers we have so far been able to articulate, does not have the property of being at a location at all. It is, in the convergent witness of foundational physics and the world's deepest contemplative traditions, the source from which the property of being at a location emerges. Where you are, then, depends on which level of analysis the question is being asked at. At the surface level, you are here. At deeper levels, the here you are at is a derivative of more fundamental features of reality that themselves are not here's. And at the deepest level any inquiry has been able to reach, The question of where you are dissolves into a different question altogether. The question of how it is that locations exist at all, and what relationship a being like yourself stands in to the non-local source from which the locations of the manifest world derive. This is the situation we now have to face, not as an abstraction but as the most personal fact about being alive. Before drawing out what it means, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first objection concerns the interpretive plurality of quantum mechanics itself. We have noted that the experimental violation of Bell's inequality establishes the failure of local realism, and that this failure is now confirmed beyond reasonable dispute. But the question of what to make of this failure, of how to interpret what is actually happening in the physical world, remains genuinely open. The Copenhagen interpretation says one thing about why entangled particles correlate in non-local ways. The de Broglie-Bohm interpretation says something different. The many worlds interpretation says something different again. Cubism says something different from all three. Each interpretation accommodates the experimental results, but each tells a different story about what is going on at the deepest physical level. The question of which interpretation is correct, or whether some yet-to-be-developed interpretation will eventually replace all the current options, has not been settled. Any framework that draws strong metaphysical conclusions from the failure of local realism has to acknowledge that the specific shape of the conclusions depends on which interpretation is being assumed. This objection deserves to be taken seriously. The structural picture we have been developing, in which classical locality fails and the deepest layer of reality is genuinely non-local, is consistent with several of the major interpretations of quantum mechanics, including the most widely accepted ones. But the specific philosophical implications that follow from non-locality differ across interpretations. On a Copenhagen reading, the non-locality is a feature of how the wave function relates to physical reality across distance. On a many worlds reading, the non-locality is a feature of how different branches of the universal wave function relate to each other. On a cubist reading, the non-locality is a feature of the relationship between observers and observed systems, rather than a feature of any observer-independent reality. The structural recognition that classical locality is not fundamental survives all of these interpretive options. But the precise account of what the deeper layer is varies considerably depending on which interpretation is being assumed. The second objection concerns the doctrine of divine omnipresence, on which several of the contemplative traditions have rested their parallel insights. The doctrine has been criticized, both within the religious traditions that hold it and from outside, on grounds of philosophical coherence. How can God be in every place without occupying space? How can the divine be everywhere without being either spatially extended, which the doctrine denies, or located in some particular place, which the doctrine equally denies? The categories of presence that we ordinarily use seem to require some form of spatiality, and a presence that lacks spatiality begins to look more like an absence than a presence. Various theologians have addressed these objections with sophisticated arguments, distinguishing presence in different modes, articulating non-spatial forms of relationship, and developing technical vocabulary for what the doctrine actually claims. But the worry remains that the doctrine is using language in ways that are not fully consistent with how the language ordinarily operates. The non-locality of the divine in the contemplative traditions may be more like a way of refusing to apply spatial concepts than like a positive specification of how the divine exists. This objection too deserves to be taken seriously. The contemplative traditions, in articulating their pictures of non-local divine reality, were at the limits of what ordinary language can do. They were using spatial vocabulary to talk about something that, on their own analysis, is not spatial. This involves them in a kind of conceptual stretching that may strain the usual operations of the relevant concepts. The honest acknowledgement is that the contemplative recognitions we have been examining are not straightforward descriptive claims about a clearly bounded subject matter. They are attempts to articulate, in language adapted to the manifest world, structural features of a reality that the language was not originally designed to handle. The articulations are illuminating but not transparent. They point towards something rather than precisely describing it. A third objection focuses on the popular abuse of these ideas, the recognition that classical locality fails, that the deepest layer of reality is non-local, that contemplative traditions have pointed at this for thousands of years, has been seized upon by various popularizers to make claims that the underlying physics and the actual contemplative traditions do not support. The most common version of this misuse is the suggestion that, since reality is fundamentally non-local, conscious thought can directly affect distant events through proper alignment with the cosmic non-local substrate. This is the manifestation industry's version of non-locality, and it is, in essential respects, a misreading of what the science and the traditions actually claim. The physics does not predict that conscious intention can influence distant events through entanglement. Quantum entanglement, as we noted, does not allow information to be transmitted faster than light, and the no-signaling theorems of quantum information theory rule out exactly the kind of effect that the popular misreadings imagine. The contemplative traditions, similarly, did not promise that recognizing non-locality would give one the ability to manipulate distant events. The traditions promised something different, and, in their own terms, more important. They promised the recognition that the deepest layer of what one is not localized, and that this recognition changes the relationship between the surface ego and the deeper reality. The promise is about insight, not about power, and the popular conflation of the two has done damage to both the science and the traditions. A fourth objection focuses on the most striking individual articulations within the contemplative traditions, particularly the utterance of Mansur al-Halak that we considered earlier. The phrase Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, has been read by many across the centuries as a claim of personal divinity, an assertion that the speaker is identifying himself with God in the strict sense. On this reading, al-Halak deserved his execution, because his utterance violated the fundamental Islamic distinction between the divine creator and the created human. The sympathetic readings we examined, in which the utterance is understood as the speech of the divine reality through al-Halak's annihilated ego, are themselves controversial within Islamic theology. They involve specific claims about what fana is and how it relates to ordinary identity, and these claims are not universally accepted within Islamic tradition. Similar objections can be raised about the strong forms of wahdat al-wujud in Ibn Arabi, which have been criticized within Islamic thought for blurring the distinction between creator and created. The recognitions we have been examining are real, but they are also contested within their own traditions, and any framework that draws conclusions from them has to acknowledge that the conclusions are not the only possible readings. This objection requires care. The contemplative traditions are not monolithic. Each contains internal debates about how to understand its own central insights. The strong articulations of non-local divine reality that we have considered in al-Halak and Ibn Arabi and Eckhart and elsewhere were controversial within their own traditions, and the controversy continues. What can be said responsibly is that these articulations represent serious traditions of contemplative inquiry, defended by serious thinkers across centuries, and that they have structural parallels to what modern physics is now articulating in different vocabulary. The convergence is real. The detailed metaphysical claims, in any specific articulation remain matters of genuine debate within the traditions themselves. The honest position is to take the structural recognitions seriously while acknowledging that the specific theological elaborations are contested. A fifth objection concerns the danger of using the recognition of non-locality as an excuse for ignoring or denigrating the ordinary level of locality at which life is actually lived. The recognition that you are not, at the deepest level, simply located in your body in this room is, in certain hands, used to justify a kind of spiritual transcendence in which the ordinary concerns of embodied life are dismissed as illusion. The body becomes unimportant. The local relationships become unimportant. The specific responsibilities of being a particular person at a particular place become unimportant, because, on the misreading, what one really is the non-local divine reality and not the local manifestation. This is, on every careful reading of the contemplative traditions themselves, a serious distortion of what they actually teach. The Vedantic recognition that you are Brahman does not entail that the body should be neglected. The Sufi recognition of Wahdat al-Wujud does not entail that the duties of ordinary life should be abandoned. The Christian recognition of divine omnipresence does not entail that ordinary spatial responsibilities are unreal. The traditions hold the recognition of non-local depth together with the affirmation of local reality. The depth is recognized, the surface is not denied, and the relationship between the two is treated as the central practical question of how to live in light of the recognition. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. Classical locality is not fundamental. The deepest layer of physical reality is non-local, in ways that experimental physics has confirmed beyond reasonable dispute. Multiple major contemplative traditions, working from entirely different methods, articulated structurally similar pictures of non-local depth. The convergence is real. The specific philosophical and theological elaborations differ across the traditions and across the interpretive options within physics. But the structural recognition is shared. And the implications for how a person can understand the most basic question of where they are, what they are, and how they relate to the rest of the universe follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that distant events can be correlated through non-local connections, the recognition we have been considering throughout, was the central insight of the earlier inquiry into what synchronicity might mean if it has a physical basis. Whatever specific account is given of synchronicity, of the apparent meaningful coincidences that seem to connect events across spatial separation, the broader recognition that classical locality fails provides a context within which such phenomena become more thinkable than the strict classical picture allowed. The deeper non-local structure of reality is the context within which any specific account of meaningful coincidence has to be developed. The recognition that the apparent distance between things is not the deepest fact about their relationship, that the spatial separation we ordinarily perceive emerges from a deeper layer that does not have the property of separating things by distance, is the central insight of the earlier inquiry into the illusion of distance. Things that appear to be far apart are, at the deepest level, expressions of the same underlying non-local substrate. The distance between them is real at its level. The distance is not the whole story. And what holds the things together, despite the apparent separation, is the non-local connection that the deeper layer provides. The recognition that the cosmos has features that suggest organized information processing on cosmic scales, with the overall structure resembling in some respects the structure of vast neural networks, takes on additional resonance in the context of recognizing that the deepest layer of reality is non-local. Whatever the specific structural similarities mean, They fit naturally into a picture in which the cosmos is integrated at a deeper level than ordinary perception registers. Local information processing within the cosmos may be related to global information processing of the cosmos in ways that the non-local picture supports. The recognition that there is a question about what the original observer of cosmic events might have been, that the relationship between observer and observed cannot be cleanly separated, that the very property of being a knowing subject is not as locally defined as ordinary perception assumes, is consistent with the picture we have been developing. The observer on this picture is not a localized agent looking at a localized world. The observer is a particular configuration of the same non-local substrate that the observed phenomena are also configurations of. The relationship between knower and known is not the relationship of two separated things connected by signals across distance. It is the relationship of two manifestations of a deeper reality that is, at the deepest level, not two and not located. The recognition that the universe is expanding, that the geometry of space itself is evolving on cosmological scales, finds its proper context in the picture of locality as derivative. Whatever drives the cosmic expansion, whatever produces the accelerating growth of the cosmos, is part of the dynamics of the deeper, non-local substrate from which the geometry of space emerges. The expansion is the unfolding of an informational and structural process at the largest scale we can observe, and its features are continuous with the local features we observe in laboratory experiments, with both being expressions of the same underlying non-local reality. The recognition that empty space is not empty, that the vacuum is the most active substrate in the universe, that the apparent emptiness between things is a region of intense fluctuation and informational structure, is closely related to the recognition that locations are derivative. The vacuum is not located anywhere in particular, because the vacuum is what every region of space is at its deepest level. The space between you and the wall is the same vacuum that is, in a different configuration, the matter of your body, and the deeper substrate that gives rise to both is, in the picture we have been building, not located in any of the regions where its manifestations appear. The recognition that information has weight, that the universe is informational at its deepest level, that the patterns of distinctions are more fundamental than the matter that the distinctions specify, is closely related to the recognition that the deepest layer is not located. Information, on the modern picture, is not localized in the way ordinary intuition treats it as being. The information that specifies a particle is, in the holographic and entanglement-based pictures, distributed across the boundary of any region containing the particle, not concentrated at the particle's apparent location. The non-locality of information and the non-locality of being are aspects of a single underlying recognition that the surface appearance of localized things is a derivative feature of a deeper reality that does not have the property of being at locations in the surface sense. The recognition that the integrated self dissolves and reconstitutes across the gap of deep sleep, that the patterns of selfhood are preserved in some substrate while the experiencing subject is absent, takes on additional meaning when the substrate is recognized as non-local. The substrate that holds the patterns of your selfhood overnight is the same substrate that holds all other patterns of physical reality, and that substrate is not located. Whatever holds you in the gap of unconsciousness holds you not in some particular location but in a deeper layer that is everywhere, precisely because it is not anywhere in the surface sense. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian theological tradition, in its long articulation of divine omnipresence, has been pointing at exactly the structural recognition that physics is now confirming. God is not in any single place because God is not the kind of reality that is located among the located things of the world. God is everywhere because God is the source from which the property of being somewhere emerges. The relationship between God and any particular location is not the relationship of two located things. It is the relationship of a non-located source to the manifested locations that derive from it. This means, when followed seriously, that you are continuously in the presence of the divine, not because you happen to be in a place where the divine has been deposited, but because the divine is the deeper layer of what every place is, and what you yourself are, at the level beneath the level of your localized manifestation. The intimate immediacy of the divine that Augustine articulated in his Interior Intimo Meo, that the Quran captured in the closer than the jugular vein, is not a poetic metaphor for spatial proximity. It is a precise structural recognition. The divine is closer than your closest interior, because the divine is what every interior is at its deepest level. The Hindu Vedantic recognition that Atman and Brahman are identical articulates the same insight in a different theological framework. What you are at the deepest level is what reality is at the deepest level. The local self that you appear to be is real at its level. The deeper level of what you are is not separate from the universal reality. That is the ground of all existence. To recognize this, in the Vedantic tradition, is the deepest insight available to a human being. The recognition does not require you to abandon the local self or to deny the conventional reality of being a particular person at a particular place. The recognition asks you to see that this conventional reality is not the deepest reality, and that the deepest reality of what you are is identical with the source from which all locations and all selves derive. The Islamic Sufi recognition in Ibn Arabi and the broader tradition that articulated Wahdat al-Wujudi points at the same structural feature with its own particular emphasis. There is, at the deepest level, only one reality. The multiplicity of locations and beings is the manifestation of this single reality in differentiated form. You are not separate from this reality, watching it from a distance. You are an aspect of how this reality manifests itself at this particular configuration. The relationship is not the relationship of one located thing to another. It is the relationship of a manifestation to the source from which the manifestation derives. And the recognition that you are this kind of relationship, rather than a separate located thing, is, in the Sufi tradition, the fruit of sustained contemplative practice. The Buddhist recognition, in its analysis of Anatman and in the elaborations of the Madhyamaka and Huayan traditions, articulates a parallel insight without the theistic framework. There is no fixed self that is located in any particular place. There is a continuous flow of arising and ceasing patterns, conditioned by everything that has come before, conditioning everything that comes after, with no fixed center to be located. The Indra's net image of the Huayan tradition captures the relational structure of this picture with particular vividness. Every location contains every other location through the reflections that constitute the deeper structure of reality. The local is real at its level. The local is also the manifestation of patterns that include every other local in the interpenetrating network that the deeper reality constitutes. Where you are, on this analysis, is everywhere through the reflections, and nowhere as a fixed independent point. The recognition is meant to be liberating. The compulsive identification with a fixed local self loosens. What emerges in the texts and the lived experience of practitioners is not nihilism but a kind of openness, a release into the actual nature of how things are. The Jewish tradition contributes the simple but profound recognition that one of the names of God is place. To call God by this name is to articulate the entire structural insight in a single word. God is not in places. God is the place that all places are in. The universal place is what makes particular places possible at all. And to live in awareness of this is to live in awareness that you are continuously in the deeper. place that the manifested places of your life are configurations of. These four religious frameworks, despite their profound differences, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of this inquiry. The orientation is not heroic spiritual practice. The orientation is not the assumption of any particular metaphysical commitment. The orientation is simply attention. Attention to what is actually present beneath the surface intuition of localized existence. Attention to the deeper layer that is not located, but that is the source of every location. Attention to the recognition that you, in your deepest aspect, share in this non-locality, even while continuing to function as a localized being at the surface. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of attention, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is to attend, occasionally during the day, to the actual experience of being where you are. Most of us pass through the day with a vague background sense of being in our bodies in particular places, never bringing this sense to focus, never asking what it actually consists of. The practice is to bring it to focus. Where exactly are you? Look at the question without rushing to the obvious answer. The body is somewhere. Where is the somewhere? Look at the boundary between the body and what is not the body. Is there a sharp line? Look at the awareness that is asking the question. Is the awareness located in the head, in the chest, somewhere else? If you bring this kind of attention to the actual experience of being where you are, you will find, slowly over time, that the answer is not as obvious as the surface ego assumes. The here you are at is not as definite as it seems. The boundaries that mark you off from the rest of reality are not as sharp as they appear. And the awareness that is having the experience is, in some sense, not as locatable as a thing in a place. A second practice is to attend to the spaces between things. When you walk through a room, you ordinarily focus on the objects, the furniture, the walls, the things that have specific locations and specific shapes. The cleared space between the objects, the regions where no things happen to be, are usually overlooked, treated as mere absence, the empty stage on which the things are arranged. The practice is to attend to the cleared space as carefully as to the objects. The space is not absent. The space is the substrate within which the objects exist. The space has the same physical reality as the objects, but in a different mode. To attend to the space is to attend to the deeper layer that the objects are configurations of. This kind of attention, practiced over time, gradually shifts the relationship between the attending self and the world that contains it. The objects are not less real. The space within which the objects exist is recognized as equally real and as the deeper context within which the objects have their particular meaningful localized existence. A third practice is more general. It is the practice of recognizing, in any moment, that the experience you are having is happening within a deeper non-local context. The thoughts that arise are not contained in your head as if your head were a private space, cut off from the rest of reality. The thoughts are arising within the deeper substrate that is also the substrate of everything else. The body that is having the experience is not a private container sealed off from the world. The body is a localized configuration of the same fields that constitute the world around it. To recognize this, even briefly, is to relate to your immediate experience differently than ordinary perception has trained you to relate to it. A fourth practice, drawn especially from the traditions that have emphasized embodied contemplation, is to attend to the boundary of the body. Most of us carry a habitual sense of where we end and the nottus begins. The skin is treated as a sharp line. The body is treated as a closed container. The world outside is treated as something separate. The practice is to attend to this boundary not as a sharp line, but as a gradient. The skin is real, but the skin is a configuration of the same kind of physical reality that exists on both sides of it. The molecules of air that touch the skin are exchanging energy and matter with the molecules of the body continuously. The fields that extend through the skin extend equally through the air. The boundary that ordinary perception treats as separating you from the world is, on careful attention, more porous, more gradient, more relational than ordinary perception assumes. Attending to this, occasionally during the day, allows the surface ego to notice that the sharp distinction between self and world that it ordinarily relies on is itself a feature of how perception is organized, rather than a feature of the underlying reality. The traditions converge on these practical instructions not because they are saying the same thing in their full theological elaborations, but because they have all noticed that ordinary attention is structured to overlook the non-local depth of reality, and that this depth becomes available to anyone who turns attention toward it. The instruction is simple. Attend to where you are. Attend to the spaces between things. Attend to the deeper context within which immediate experience is happening. The instruction is not promising mystical experiences or transformative breakthroughs. The instruction is offering a redirection of attention that changes, slowly over time, the relationship between the attending self and the substrate that is being attended to. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition that you are not, at the deepest level, simply located in your body in this room. A recognition that what you most fundamentally are is connected to everything else through a non-local substrate that ordinary perception does not register. A recognition that the relationship between you and the deeper layer of reality from which your existence continuously derives is the most fundamental relationship of your life, and that this relationship has been there all along, available for attention, waiting for you to notice. The body that reads these words is somewhere. The eyes are focused on a specific surface. The brain is processing specific signals. All of this is real at its level. And at the same time, the atoms of the body are localized excitations of fields that extend throughout all of space. The geometry of the room is woven from non-local entanglement. The local properties of every part of you depend on the global structure of the universe. And the deepest layer of what you are is on the convergent witness of multiple lines of inquiry, not located in any particular place at all. Both pictures are true. Both pictures describe the same reality from different levels, and the practice the traditions invite you to is the practice of not collapsing either picture into the other, of holding them together, of recognizing that the local you is real, and that the local you is also a manifestation of something that is not local. The fear that ordinary perception carries about being a small, localized being in a vast, indifferent universe rests on the assumption that being localized is what you fundamentally are. The recognition that the inquiries have been pointing at is that this assumption is, while accurate at its level, not the deepest fact about you. You are localized at one level. You are non-local at a deeper level. And the non-locality is not the loss of your identity. The non-locality is the recognition that what you are extends, at its deepest level, beyond the surface localization, that the surface ego mistakes for the totality of what it is. When you lie down tonight, the body will be in a particular place, in a particular room. The specific patterns that constitute your localized existence will be, for the duration of sleep, modified into different configurations. And tomorrow, when consciousness reactivates into the morning self, the body will still be where it was. The local you will continue. But the local you has always been an expression of something that is not local. The expression continues. The non-local substrate continues. And the relationship between them, the relationship that is the deepest fact of your existence, continues whether you attend to it or not. The recognition is available now. It does not require special technique, special belief, special initiation. It requires only the willingness, in some moments of your remaining days, to notice what has always been the case. The substrate is already there. The non-locality is already what holds your locality in being. The relationship between you and the deeper layer of reality from which your existence continuously derives is already happening, in every moment, whether you attend to it or not. The traditions that have pointed at this for thousands of years did not invent the relationship. They noticed something that was always there. The physics that has now articulated structurally similar pictures from entirely different methods is also noticing something that was always there. What is being recognized by both lines of inquiry is the way reality actually is. Where are you? The question, finally, has multiple answers, each true at its level. You are here, in this room, reading these words. You are also in the body in the room in the building on the planet in the cosmos. You are also a localized excitation of fields that extend throughout all of space, a configuration of patterns within an entanglement-woven geometry, a particular manifestation of a substrate whose deepest layer is not located anywhere in the way you have been taking yourself to be located. You are everywhere through your participation in the non-local substrate that constitutes you. You are nowhere in particular because the deepest layer of what you are does not have a particular location. And the question of how to inhabit this complex reality, this multi-layered presence in a universe whose deepest layer is not local, is the question that the rest of your days will be the time you have to answer. Tonight, when you close your eyes, tomorrow, when you open them, every breath you take in between, the non-locality is there. The locality is also there. The relationship between them is what your life is. You did not author this relationship. The relationship was given to you with your existence. And the recognition of it when it finally lands is not anxiety about where you are, but a kind of grateful astonishment at the non-local depth that has been holding you in being all along, present in every place, precisely because not anywhere in the way you have been taking yourself to be present.